been on this journey with us so far. On this final synchronous session, we have a lot of content that we want to share with you. And also, I wanted to stress that as we hit this final week, the missions will be around the final principle on Be Data Driven. So this is very apropos because we will be talking about data today and EdTech information. At the end, we'll also be reviewing the final project, but you'll see in the invite the very simple 6-slide presentation that we'll be working towards at the end of the week. We'll be coming back together for our final synchronous session on Friday, in which we'll have everybody together to share their final presentations and projects. Today, we will be looking at going in depth on both EMIS with colleague Agatha, as well as on LMS with a colleague Fred. But please, as we go through today's session, raise any questions you might have in the chat, and also use the function to raise your hand for any questions. To kick off today, we're very pleased to have with us Maria, who's the founder of Holon IQ, which is one of the largest data intelligence platforms in the world with information on EdTech. I'll allow Maria to give a more full description of herself and Holon IQ, but I think as many of you begin to look at last week's focus on engaging the ecosystem and who else is active in your countries, regionally, globally, the type of data that Maria is going to share with you today, I think, is very relevant to understand who else you might be able to be collaborating with in the broader EdTech ecosystem. So without any further ado, let me pass over to Maria. Thanks for being with us again, Maria. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and hi, everyone. Present on this Policy Academy, and congratulations to all the participants. So it sounds like you're almost at the end of the course. So I've no doubt you've got a lot out of it. I think my presentation should be being shared right now, and I can't see it there, but hopefully you can all see the presentation. Just let me know when that's coming. It looks like it's coming through, but let me give me a little quick introduction. So as said, I'm Maria Spies, co-founder and co-CEO of Holon IQ. We're a market intelligence platform, and what we do is track trends in education and EdTech and all the things that are happening and the innovations that are occurring, particularly in the world of education and EdTech. Particularly, not only, but particularly where the money is going, the funding, and what sort of trends and business models are growing, where traction is being seen. And so my presentation today, and we'll have time for Q&A, and please put it into the chat as well, is to provide an overview, sort of global overview of EdTech, number one. I'm going to be talking about trends and emerging solutions, what we're seeing. And, I know that you are all from all different parts of the world. I've tried to be more focused on some of the areas that you work and live in, and then we can have time for questions and discussion. So if we can skip to the next slide and the one after, that would be great. As I said, next one as well, through the next one, Holon IQ, we're a marketing. Moving on to the next one, let's jump into the content though. One of the things that's happening right now in the world is that not only because of COVID, but if you can jump to the next slide, that would be wonderful. Not only because of COVID, but even before that, EdTech is, I think we've skipped a slide actually. EdTech is accelerating. And what we're seeing between 2019 and 2025, we have sized the global education market and the EdTech market. And what we're seeing though is overall in education, only around between 3 and 5% of total education spend is on tech. Sorry, go back one, a couple now. So there's only about 3 to 5% is spent on EdTech. or technology in education. Now that sort of makes sense. A lot of money, of course, is to put into school infrastructure and teachers and so on like that. But COVID has changed a lot of things, and there's a lot more focus now on where spending in technology and the importance of infrastructure particularly. And so over the next couple of years, what we're seeing, and we're already seeing that, is a bigger build on spend from governments, particularly around digital infrastructure catch-up, essentially. Now, that could be access to the internet, or it could be learning management systems, learning environments, privacy and security of technology and data. And so, there's quite a lot of traction in that space over now and over the next couple of years, as particularly in K-12, that sort of infrastructure builds. And then what we will see is more movement into more sophisticated type, whether it be digital content or adaptive platforms or mobile or, other sort of advanced technology. So growth in EdTech is there, but overall, it's still relatively a small spend compared to with the rest in education. Now, just on the slide that we're looking at now, we also track where venture capital money is going. Venture capital money is growth money. And so that indicates that, I guess, investment speculators are looking at the education sector and thinking, well, I think I want to put my money in education, not only because it's worthwhile, but of course, they're looking for a return, they're investors. And the chart that you see in front of you really says it all, just the shape of that chart between 2020, 2021 and what we're already seeing in 2022 in terms of the growth in venture capital. So this is private capital coming into education, which is also needed to fuel that innovation. And just a few nuances there. You can probably see the red bar across the bottom there is China, and that has collapsed over the last couple of years, over the last 2 years, due to regulation, and that's mostly after-school tutoring, which was effectively regulated out of existence from the government. So we're seeing a collapse in investment in China in terms of EdTech, but a surge in the US and India and Europe, and even frankly sort of the rest of the world. It's really growing, and so we're seeing a lot more focus on EdTech from private investment, which is good news for the most part. If you can jump to the next slide, that would be great. One of the things that's important though is, well, where actually is this private capital going? And this is a chart which shows every one of those circles is an investment round. So it's a private capital round into education, EdTech. And the size of the circle is the size of the round. So there's a couple of really huge ones there, and they're like billion-dollar deals, essentially. But, the colours are important here. So workforce learning is around half of all private investment in EdTech goes into workforce. About a third probably into K-12, a smaller amount into higher education, and even smaller into early childhood. So you can sort of see where that private capital is heading. And if we jump to the next slide, context matters in education. You know this better than anyone else. And so, for example, in Europe, it's a big workforce story. That looks like the shape of the global, but that's just Europe over the last couple of years. And if we go to the next slide, which is Asia, the Asia sort of domain, then mainly it's a K-12 story. I mean, demographics may play a very, very big part in this, obviously. And so it's not all the same all around the world. Although one can always learn from what's happening in different parts of the world, but context is very important. And if we can go to the next one, what we have done at Holland IQ is build a taxonomy, a structure, a framework, essentially, that helps us and helps others to segment EdTech into more granular areas, because, what's happening in curriculum and education resources or digital content is completely different to what's happening in, for example, upskilling or games and simulation. They're just different markets, essentially. And so we have built this taxonomy, and all our data and information is mapped to this taxonomy, and it allows us to really identify where trends are happening in each of the sort of essentially the value chain, starting at knowledge and content, curriculum, education resources over the left, moving to education management, new delivery models, all the way through to experiencing learning and assessment and verification and workforce and upskilling. So, this framework can be very helpful when trying to consider around. And so if you just jump onto the next slide, one of the things that we've been looking at, and I mentioned it earlier, was that digital infrastructure for learning is building. And, you can't have digital learning or online learning or anything tech if you're not connected or you don't have devices. And so one of the key areas in education generally for infrastructure is the learning management system, or the learning environment essentially. And this chart shows the funding or the private capital that's going into learning environments over the last 4 years. And already you can see what happened in 2021. Massive, unbelievable. And so this is teams and not only investors, but teams, EdTech teams, essentially preparing themselves for a huge demand in digital learning. That doesn't mean everything's going online, but certainly there will be more fundamental aspects of learning that will be digitally enhanced or digitally delivered. And so learning environments is a must, and we can see a lot of money and private capital going into this space. And if you jump to the next one, the other area that I talked about was workforce and upskilling being a big focus. And one of the sort of models that's very popular at the moment in all parts of the world essentially is essentially short course digital skills training, and often in the form of boot camps. These are all over the world, and with the sort of shortage of digital skills around the place, these sorts of models have been again, you can see what happened in 2021, lots and lots of funding going into this area, because on the one hand, traditional deliverers of education, especially in the post-secondary space, so after school, are just really not set up to deliver at the speed, to deliver the types of outcomes that people are looking for, and employers are looking for, at the speed required. And that is tech skills and short courses and new types of things like cybersecurity or coding or digital marketing or whatever it may be. And so we're seeing this sort of big rise in alternative, you might say, or adjunct essentially, models, short course training in digital skills. And these models are being funded, which is good. They sort of started out in a direct to consumer model, but actually now are moving much, much more closely to partnering with governments for digital skills, partnering with universities, partnering with industry associations, partnering with industry associations and also employers. And so we're seeing some changes even in business models here as time goes on. If we can jump to the next slide as well. I want to jump into K-12 because these are what we're seeing here is the top 10 categories of EdTech funding. EdTech funding shows confidence in traction, and that's growth and that's demand. So that's good to know about where the demand is happening. The top 10 EdTech funding categories through 2020 and 2021. The very top one, and this is the green segments, the very top one was learning environments, like I talked about before, not only just in higher education or workforce, but in K-12 as well. Schools are looking to provide an environment in which digital resources can be accessed or learning can occur, and that's learning environments. Second top one, but biggest by far in K-12 is STEAM and coding. Again, there's this focus on technology skills and hands-on learning as well, even from an early age. And on, as you can see down the list there, upskilling, that's not a K-12 story. Education management, which is partly this digital infrastructure. Because the sort of learning loss that we've seen and governments and also individuals and schools are employing extra tutoring for children. And so that's definitely happening. And what I think is really interesting is that wellness, which is social emotional learning, mental health, other sorts of rounded education outside the formal curriculum, made it to the top 10 of investment in K-12 over the last couple of years. That really says something about where the focus is. And I don't think this is going to go away either, but there's lots of great teams doing very interesting things. If we can jump to the next slide. What we also do, and you might, I put the URL down the bottom of this deck, and you should be given this PDF deck after the presentation, so you can go to it. But we track the most promising EdTech teams in different countries around the world, different geographies. And what I've put here is the geographies that I think mainly show where the group from today is. So Latin America, Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. I think that's mostly where people are from. And so these are the maps of the sorts of innovations that are occurring in those geographies. And there's a lot of innovations occurring in those geographies, categorized into that market map that I showed before in terms of our framework. So workforce and skills, STEAM and coding, tutoring and test prep. So you can really very quickly, if you're wondering what's going on in my part of the world in terms of EdTech innovation, these maps are a very quick way of having a look at that. And if we can jump to I want to spotlight on a few here. If we can jump to the next one. So for example, in Africa, and this is where, for example, like I said before, that context is very important. What's important in Sub-Saharan Africa might be quite different to what's happening or needed in Southeast Asia, for example. And what we see here is some examples of the challenge of infrastructure in Africa, for example. So Enisa Education or MSchul are, and all of them actually, Snaplify and Hitch, they offer either learning through text messages, because a lot of people have got phones, but not necessarily smartphones. And so they go with the technology that's available to the people, or online and offline books, education resources, TV learning, videos. And so the ability to work on and offline is particularly important in many parts of this particular geography. And so the EdTech solutions support the local sort of context, essentially. But through that URL before, you'll be able to see and dive a bit more deeply into what's happening in that area. And if we jump onto the next slide, it's also an example of Middle East and North Africa, and same sort of thing in terms of the type of solutions that are being provided to learners directly or through schools and universities and so on in Middle East and North Africa, from management systems that provide a sort of infrastructure for schools, through to workforce upskilling and tech courses, tutoring and test prep, and STEAM and coding. These sorts of solutions are really purpose fit for the geography. One of the things that I noticed on the survey that you all had completed, or some of you had completed, was that there was a really big interest in supporting teachers. And this is a very, very important area, and I wanted to dive into a little bit. But before if we can jump onto the next slide, I've just highlighted a few of these teams that are undertaking and doing very, very interesting things. These three happen to be in Africa. Hitch, for example, providing schools with a video platform with curated educational content from a video library. It's matched against curriculum, battery-powered hotspots, things that are very purpose-built for the environment in which the learning is occurring. Same sort of with MSchul and Enisa Education. They're the text message learning, supporting students without smartphones. And Kano, which is a pre-K app, homeschooling app for early childhood. So this is supporting parents to be able to, provide them with essentially pre-K curriculum to support ongoing learning of early childhood, which we know is a very important part of overall learning. And if we jump to the next slide, I wanted to pull out a few examples of teams that are making a big impact in teacher education or teacher support, supporting teachers to support learning for their students. Because if you can provide support and professional development and so on to 100 teachers, then you've already impacted thousands of students. And I know that that's a focus for some of you. So here are some, ANAB, which is it's a great team. It's, you know, really very interesting, out of Saudi Arabia, offering professional development courses in Arabic for teachers and educators to help them improve all sorts of skills, whether it be tech, educational strategies, techniques, tools, etc. Zabuza, which is in South Africa, same sort of thing, online professional learning community. Same with Guru Innovative, which is out of Indonesia. It's a sort of certified professional online platform for teachers. And based to EU is from Brazil, a network of educators. One of the things that I think is very interesting when you start, I mean, there's many more, 1 million teachers and so on like that, but when you start looking at some of these teams, what they're doing is building a platform that actually is a curated, but often it's a peer-to-peer platform. So it builds the base for teachers to be able to support each other in their professional development. So, and building a network, a peer-to-peer network of educators for professional development, and in a structured way. But that seems to be a very popular but also effective way of supporting professional development in a, you know, at scale, essentially. So connecting these teachers up with each other through a platform. And so I wanted to pull a few things up like that. The other thing onto the next slide is, it's not just the innovation teams that are doing things, but in basically all geographies, technology companies, publishers, foundations, and others are, you know, delivering amazing programs and whether it be campuses or initiatives, really very interesting in EdTech. I mean, for example, all the tech companies from Microsoft to Google to Amazon and so on are doing all sorts of very interesting things in supporting not only the EdTech, but also building hubs, essentially, like tech hubs, support hubs for entrepreneurs who are operating not only in education, but in other parts as well. Most recently, we completed quite a large project mapping the EdTech ecosystem in Latin America. I know some of you are from Latin America in the room today, and we're just about to do a similar thing across Africa. And I mean, it's a very big report, it's on our website. But one of the things we asked the EdTech companies, what support do they need? What would they like to see? And so if you jump to the next slide, which shows, it's just one chart out of this very big report. One of the things that EdTechs really want is initiatives to incentivize the use of EdTech in schools and universities. They want to see, whether it be the schools and universities themselves or school systems or governments or departments of education or whoever, they do want to see initiatives, and they'd love to better connect through test beds and things like that with schools and universities. They are, of course, always interested in better access to growth capital. It's very, very difficult for EdTech when they're small to get over that sort of growth sort of stage, because the returns essentially take a long time in EdTech. And so that sort of growth capital really helps them get across that early stage difficulty. Better early stage support is part of that. The other thing that EdTech is very interested in, the support they require, is better connectivity to others in the region, in their ecosystem. And so solutions or initiatives that can help support EdTechs connect with each other, and, you know, the broader ones that are more grown up and so on is also really very valued by EdTech. As I said, this was a survey of hundreds and hundreds of EdTech entrepreneurs and teams in Latin America, and we're going to be doing this same research across Africa in the later part of 2022. So it'll be fascinating to see if that's the same sort of support is needed. And if we move to the next slide, what I wanted to pull up here was that there are local tech hubs already emerging to support entrepreneurs and local solutions. Now, this is not only EdTech, but that's okay. But tech hubs, because EdTech can learn a lot from FinTech and MedTech and other sorts of, from other industries. And so hubs that support entrepreneurs generally are very, very well needed and well supported by the sort of tech community essentially. And this is happening, but needed more, I think. And so I want to sort of wrap up there. I think we're right on time, but I think we do have time for some questions or conversation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Maria, fantastic presentation. This is always, I always learn something new listening to you. Very informative. I'd like to pass to my colleague Marjorie, who's going to moderate our Q&A. We have a few questions that are popping up in the chat. Marjorie, over to you.
Awesome.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Maria, for this insightful presentation. I really enjoyed those funding circles. So we will have a few questions from the audience. I already saw one question from Himdat. Her question is, can you elaborate what you mean by workforce in those funding circles?
Yeah, so workforce are solutions that support ongoing upskilling of adults, essentially. Usually, not always, but mostly it's related to work, the skills for work, or the upskilling for work, or the reskilling for work. Obviously, there is a lot of learning that occurs for hobbies and pleasure and so on, but we're talking really about professional work upskilling.
Thank you very much, Maria. I don't know if that answered him that question. I want to know if anyone have any question, insight, comments about the presentation from Maria. Maybe one of the countries wants to mention how those funding circle looks like in your countries, how the EdTech investment looks like there.
I think
Marjorie, I'll jump in. I'll jump into the breach. I put a question in. I think one of the interesting aspects is the challenges around how you engage with the broader ecosystem, how you identify kind of who the players are, how you can support them either through development of innovation hubs or through maybe early stage grant funding. So I wonder, Maria, if you can share a little bit about, this question that you raised of how ministries of education can help develop this ecosystem, and what are some models that you've seen being successful over?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things, where this has been successful in different parts of the world, it's really interesting that it's been a coalition of support between different government departments, not just one department, usually. So, for example, in Singapore is a wonderful example where the Department of Education, Ministry of Education, and the Ministry of Labour and the Ministry of Innovation, I think it is. And so those three are economic development. So those three departments have sort of connected together and worked together in sync to develop initiatives. The same can be said in Japan, and there's a really great EdTech test bed program that's been going on for a number of years there, where it's multiple sort of government departments that have connected with each other to build, in this case, a EdTech sort of pilot test bed program where EdTech companies can apply to be part of the test bed initiative, and if they're approved, then schools can use the tools and engage with that EdTech and be implemented and do a pilot, and there's evaluation. It's all sort of set up in a program, but the schools don't have to pay for any of the tool itself or the teacher time out of teaching that they have to put aside to do professional development to get to know how to use it. It's all covered under this program. And that's one of the big challenges for schools, particularly, and teachers particularly. They are full up doing their teaching already, and to have to step out to try something new, they just don't have the time, and sometimes they don't have the skill. They need to be trained. And so some of these pilot programs can take the burden off the individual teachers and provide funding for like relief teachers, so that the teacher can come out and do the training and then have the proper time and training to embed back into the school. And there's some examples like that. The other thing that both of these examples, and there are others, but both of these examples particularly, they're long-term approaches. They're not something that where it's a 6-month thing or even a 1-year thing or even a 2-year thing. They're 5-10-year commitments. It's a longer term sort of, as part of a longer term strategy, I guess, because there's a lot of things that go into EdTech innovation, it's part curriculum, and that's policy. It's part infrastructure, and that's IT, and it's part culture and capability of teachers, etc. So there's a whole range of different things that need to be sort of thought through, I guess, in doing these initiatives.
Thank you, Maria. We have a few questions in the chat. I don't know if we can still cover. One of the questions is, what kind of regulation were introduced in China that inhibit investment that much? And do you anticipate similar government actions in other countries as the industry grows across the globe?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the EdTech industry in China would be pre-2020, or pre-2021, probably something like 80% consisting of the after-school tutoring market for maths and English and curriculum and so on, online after-school tutoring, even English language. And that's where all the money was going, and that's where there's the vast majority of students who could afford it in China would be doing some sort of after-school tutoring, and the government effectively shut down that whole industry by saying no private company can deliver after-school tutoring of curriculum, yes, to sport and arts and painting and things like that, but not to curriculum, and be a for-profit entity. So they banned the ability to be a for-profit entity, and therefore no one has a business, and it shut down the whole industry, and so no investment is going in there. There are all sorts of good reasons for them doing this, by the way, not the least of which was their very deep concern for student well-being and mental health. The very, very, very competitive market for exam results and things like that was causing some very difficult, some difficulties mental health-wise for lots and millions of children. And not only that, it was really concerned for equity, because only if you had the money could you pay for these after-school tutoring. And if you could pay for it, then you got better results, and then it further made an inequitable system. So they effectively just shut down the system. The ability of governments to do that sort of thing is limited, typically by the way that the government is set up, but China is a communist country, so it has the ability to do that. We don't really see that to that extent happening in other parts of the world. Although, having said that, there are some murmurings around concerns in India, for example, for the same sort of overheated market. The government doesn't like to see anyone inequitable outcomes for students or anyone being sort of, where only people with money can actually access education. They do not like to see that. No government likes to see that. So they won't go to the same extent, but I think EdTech in India is starting to try to self-regulate so it doesn't get too overheated.
Thank you so much, Maria. We have a few more questions, but we are running out of time. We have a packed agenda today. So
yes.
Thank you very much. If you can spend maybe a few minutes looking at the chat, we have some questions about Africa. So appreciate the presentation. Thank you very much. So we're going to move to the next presenter. We have Agatha Mutin that is going to present about EMIS. She's going to have a technical presentation about the EMIS, and then we're going to have a couple questions around the EMIS topics. After that, we will have Federico Carvalho, who's going to be presenting about learning management systems. Agatha, over to you.
Okay, all right, thank you. Let me know if you can see the presentation.
We can see it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay. So thank you so much for the introduction. So what I'm going to do is going to go through a really condensed version of the EMIS 2.0 knowledge pack. The full knowledge pack, as some of you have seen, is over 125 pages. So this is a super condensed version of it. All I have here is 6-7 high-level slides to help you just get an understanding of what the idea behind all of this is. To get started, I would like to emphasize the fact that EMIS 2.0 is a framework, right? It's a framework with regards to how you design your infrastructure, technology infrastructure. So this is not an actual piece of software that any countries should be planning on deploying. So, okay, so just a quick reminder in terms of what is EMIS 2.0. So I want us to start by looking at what traditional EMIS is, which many of the countries online right now already have implemented. Because once we define that, then we can just quickly review and see what EMIS 2.0 tries to address in comparison to that. So traditional EMIS implementations in majority of countries that we've looked at are usually set up in this way. So to begin with, it's census data collection, and this is essentially just demographic data that's being collected. So what is the age and gender of our students? What are the enrollment and dropout rates? And then a little bit of assessment data and student population numbers, and that is all. This is usually just done periodically, and it's essentially just a one-way transfer. So the schools are collecting all of this data and they're sending it up to the counties or the provinces and then up to the federal government, if that's what a country has in place, but there's not necessarily any transfer of information back to the schools. So really there's no direct benefit that the people who are collecting the data are actually able to understand that they're getting from all of this additional work that they're doing. So it's one way, but then not necessarily a feedback loop coming back to them after that data has been reviewed and analyzed. Thirdly, the data is currently in majority of these countries being collected on paper. In some countries now we have maybe mobile phones or some online systems that are running on the phone, so not necessarily SMS based, but internet based. Transferred to a central government office, when then from that central office, it is then updated into the central EMIS database. So essentially we don't have data going directly from schools into the EMIS in most cases. Fourthly, the data is usually being just collected for reporting purposes. So we want to report how many students we have, how many females we have, what the attendance rates are at. So it's purely for reporting. So there's no analysis or early warning systems that are being incorporated into this to guide future decision making and, essentially improve learner outcomes. So I just have an image there showing what this one-way transfer looks like with the traditional EMIS 1.0. With those kind of implementations, what we've seen and what I'm sure you've all seen is there's basically below average results for the ministries of education. So they implement these systems hoping that somehow there's going to be some grand improvement in terms of learner outcomes, but they don't necessarily see those results. So what's the difference between what I've just shown there and what we are calling EMIS 2.0? So remember, as I said earlier, EMIS 2.0 is essentially just a framework of how to approach data collection and analysis. So in terms of the critical systems and processes, I have here a key comparison between EMIS 1.0 and what we recommend and show you how to do in EMIS 2.0. So the first one is a data governance process. In EMIS 1.0, data is collected manually most of the time on paper, and there's no clear data governance process to ensure the integrity of data between when it's collected at the school level and when it finally ends up in the EMIS database with the central government. So with EMIS 2.0, one of the key policy areas that we look at that need to be implemented so that the data is actually valid to be used for decision-making process is to have a data governance policy in place. Second thing is interoperability of systems. So with EMIS 1.0, what we've seen, and I'm sure what you've seen in many of your countries, is that we have a lot of disjointed systems that are collecting different pieces of data. And these different systems are not necessarily talking to each other, right? So maybe there's one system collecting student data, another one collecting assessment data, a different one collecting teacher data, but there's no link and way for these different systems to communicate with each other. So the data is very siloed and therefore is less impactful when you want to do analysis across these different data sources. This third point is linked very much to the previous one. So there's no clear data flow which links the learning systems, the assessment systems, and the reporting systems in the traditional EMIS 1.0 architecture. With EMIS 2.0, that is part of the mandate. Fourth piece is identity management. Identity management has been seen to be a very critical way to link all these different pieces of data. So if you're going to analyze learner performance, you might want to necessarily have a link to, was that learner of that specific ID trained by this teacher who we know went through a specific teacher training program, as an example, right? So you cannot make that inference if there's no unique IDs identifying that specific learner and that specific teacher. So with EMIS 2.0, identity management is one of the key things that we emphasize. The last piece is microservices. So instead of having one massive system that does everything that the Ministry of Education has ever wanted to accomplish using technology, the mandate in EMIS 2.0 is to break this into smaller chunks, which is what we're calling microservices. So each microservice basically meets a singular or a small set of similar objectives. So what the implication here is, number one, you don't have one vendor who is responsible for your entire, software database, as an example, right? So that dependency on a single vendor is removed because you will have multiple vendors whose software have to talk to each other based on the fact that we've already mandated the interoperability of systems. So that is the fifth piece. So I'm going to show here, the last one is the effectiveness and analysis of data and dissemination. So, linked to what we showed before, what we've seen traditionally is a lot of data is being collected, but there's not necessarily a lot of analysis that is being done with that data, whether that data was collected using manual systems or automated systems. It's collected, it's printed out, it's put into a report, and essentially that's the end of it. There's not analysis. With EMIS 2.0, that is a key part of system design. So I don't know if there's any questions, by the way. On my screen, I can't see anything, so I'm just going to move to the next slide. So this slide automates what the ideal end state system is. I would like to emphasize that, this is the end state desire, but it is not necessarily where you need to get to at the end of year one, right? But this is the end goal. So the first piece is, as I mentioned, so using microservice architecture. So you can see here that we have a whole bunch of different systems that are generating data or that are using data that is generated by another system, instead of what EMIS 1.0 had, where you'd have a monolithic system accomplishing each of these tasks. So that's point one. So you have this student information system, finance system, the professional development system, LMS, all of these individually are creating data that is going into centralized database, which takes us to part 2. So part 2 is basically an interoperable system which connects and manages all data centrally and assigns and manages the unique IDs that we talked about in the previous slide. Third part is reports are generated with appropriate access level. What this essentially means is, you know, the consumers of this data are several, right? I'm sorry, I have all this background noise. I'm sitting in a classroom. So there's different stakeholders that will require access to this information. Parents might want to get their specific children's data. The principal will want to know overall at class level or at teacher level. Teachers as well will want to be able to access this data. And then at a higher level, you have the MOE leaders. So each of these users should have appropriate access levels to be able to access this centrally managed data. From that, basically, we have reports that are being generated for each of these different stakeholders. So those are different reports, which, you know, should help inform instruction and the reallocation of resources. So this, you know, links us back to, we don't have data purely for the sake of reporting it. There's a level of analysis that is being done by the different stakeholders so that you can go back and make a determination in terms of where should we actually be increasing or decreasing or changing the way we have allocated our resources. And then with part 5, that should hopefully result in student and teacher improvement and enable basically the continuous collection of information for future success. So data dissemination principles. And then the last piece, which is really important, is there's feedback back to schools. So after that analysis is done and, you know, either new programs are designed for implementation, then there's feedback to the schools, you know, stating there's this new program and this program is designed to specifically address what we have found with the data that we collected from you. Any questions? No? All right, so ultimately what we have here is a virtuous cycle of data generation, consumption, and feedback. So data will always be generated with one, and then, you know, it's analyzed, a program is created, it is implemented back, and then data is collected about that new program, and so on and so forth. Which data should we be collecting? So I kept this slide from the big massive deck because from a lot of the current programs that I've seen running in countries, we still have a focus on collecting purely demographic data. So I just wanted to put this in just to remind us that there's a lot of other data that we should be collecting that can help inform what programs we should be implementing ultimately in the schools. So there's 4 main categories of data: demographic data, which we're already collecting, and then perceptions data is essentially the values and beliefs of parents, students, and teachers. So what do parents think about educating girls, as an example? We need to collect that data because those perceptions are ultimately impacting how, as an example, the girls are actually going to perform. So if you don't have that data, the programs that you're designing are not addressing changing that perception in parents, as an example. Third piece is student learning data. This is collected in most places. And then the fourth piece is school programs data. So I'm just going to animate this in the next slide to see how all of this comes together. So demographic data, as we said, this is already being collected in majority of places. It is the grade levels, attendance, dropout rates, ethnicity. Here we have perceptions data, as I just said, and then the student learning data, school processes data. So why do we need all of these? The focus is on the overlap. When you have demographic data overlaid with perceptions data, then the analysis that you're going to be able to do is that much more powerful. So this area where I highlight, where we have the one, when you overlay those two pieces of data and have, you know, the systems that are generating this data actually be able to talk to each other, then an insight that you're going to be able to get is, you know, are there some groups of students who are experiencing school differently, right? Based on that, then you would be able to design a program that changes the experience of that group of students, as an example. Number 2, so what's the relationship between perceptions and student outcomes? So if we're purely looking at student learning data, then you might be missing a big piece if you've not understood the perceptions, because the student learning data might be showing us that a certain category of students are not performing well. What perceptions data tells us is, okay, what are the perceptions of the teachers, the learners, and the parents of those students? Once we know that, then maybe the program needs to actually focus purely on tackling perceptions. And once perceptions are tackled, then we might start to see an improvement in the student learning data. But if we haven't collected this piece of perceptions data, then, you know, we're missing an entire bullet of what it is that's needed to basically improve student learning data. Third piece here is an overlay of the program's data and the assessments, right, the student learning data. So when we look at this piece here, number 3, these 2 circles overlapping, that data there will tell us which programs are most effective in improving student outcomes. So if there's a specific math program, as an example, that has been implemented in specific school districts, and then you're able to then compare the assessments on a high stakes exam, it's the same high stake exam across the country, you can therefore assess, okay, that this specific math program seems to have impacted the math scores in the high stakes program, the high stakes exam for this specific school. So therefore, perhaps maybe that program should be implemented in more schools. Fourth piece here is an overlay of the demographic data and school processes data. When we look at this overlap here, basically what it will tell us is all subgroups of students are being represented in the different programs. So as an example, if there's a specific math program that is on offer, are girls actually attending that program? Right? You see that because you're looking at the demographic data and you're comparing it with the actual school programs data. Because if you do not have all genders adequately being represented in that program, then it will ultimately then impact the assessment results. But you will only know that if you've collected both pieces of data and been able to overlay them. Last piece here is an overlay of all 4 different categories, all 4 different measures. So that's that star that I have there. If you have the overlay of all 4 categories, then it becomes really powerful. So as an example, what you'd be able to answer, the question you'd be able to answer is, are students of different ethnicities perceiving the learning environment differently? And are they therefore scoring differently on high-stake exams in patterns that are consistent with these perceptions? There's no way of being able to answer this question unless you have actually collected all 4 different measures. Any questions on this, or do I move on to the next slide?
Yeah, Agatha, I think let's finish the presentation because
Okay.
we have a very limited amount of time.
Okay, no problem. So now I move on to a slide which basically, it shows the 4 core EMIS policy areas that EMIS 2.0 looks like. In the larger deck that we've created, I focus mainly on system soundness, so how countries can ensure system soundness as well as quality data. But the importance of this slide is to highlight that over and above that, we do need an enabling environment for part 2 and 3 to actually make sense. So are there specific data protection policies that the country has? Because if they don't, then, you know, we might have a challenge with quality data. So the policy level of stuff is not addressed in the EMIS 2.0 knowledge pack, but we've put it here to highlight that it is important. It is critical that the enabling environment actually exists prior to this, or is at least considered. And then the 4th piece is the utilization for decision making. We don't go through a deep analysis of how to actually do that in the EMIS 2.0 knowledge pack, but as mentioned before, it's a key component that is recommended when we are starting to collect all of this data. So where should my country begin? So what I have here is the roadmap that countries should consider if they desire to have the end state that I showed in the earlier slide. So upfront, you can see right there, we have it as a 4-year process, which from my experience, a lot of countries think, feel 4 years is too long because they want the results now. But the challenge is it's like building a house. If you don't have the foundational components in place at the beginning that it is not going to be possible to yield the results that we've discussed earlier. So in year one, this is what we recommend. I'm going to actually just put them all in at once. Initially, there needs to be a country planning team, and I think by default, most of the countries that I've dealt with will put this into place, but we need them to have the right expertise. So Appendix A, which I'm not going to go into now, but it is in the long form of this knowledge pack, details the expertise of the team that is required within MOE to be able to launch EMIS 2.0. Second piece is to conduct a needs assessment. What my experience has been is the needs assessment step is completely skipped. There's an assumption that is made that the need is to collect data, but the need is not actually to collect data, right? The assumption should be that the data is being collected for a specific purpose, to give specific insights so that learner outcomes can be improved. Because if we think about it as we just want to collect data, collecting data is not a very difficult task. That can be done, but then the results ultimately in terms of improved learner outcomes will not be seen. The third piece is to determine which target SDG4 indicators are to be tracked. And then, finally go into the applications and data architecture. So look at the existing data flow and applications that exist within MOE, and then define, so that's the baseline, and then define what the target is. What I would like to emphasize with this specific point is it doesn't matter if everything is manual. Whether it's manual or already there's some applications and systems in place, that actually doesn't matter for point 4. In both cases, we do need to map how is data collected and what is the flow of that data, whether it is manually or whether it's actually used in applications. And then finally, how do we migrate the data from the existing systems or from the manual paper format into new systems? So create a data migration plan. And then only then should we then start to look at the technology architecture. So looking at the necessary hardware and software and all the IT infrastructure, in terms of internet, electricity access, that's going to be required to basically deploy that system. And then finally, as we mentioned before, there's the identifier, which is quite critical. And only then, when all of these pieces are done, should we start to look at different EMIS systems that are in the market and determine which one of these will be able to meet these needs. And then finally, do the RFP. So I have quickly flipped through what happens in year 2, 3, and 4. But as you can see within year 1, it's really only at the end that we are considering what system to purchase. And then year 2 is when we recommend the selection of vendors and then piloting this within a small scale before deploying it across the country. I think that is all that I wanted to cover. So Alex, maybe I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Agatha. Colleagues, please put any questions you have in the chat. But to kick it off, I have a few questions that I thought that we commonly hear about this EMIS topic, and I'll quickly go through them. So Agatha, one of the things you said, in year 2 we should consider the purchase after going through all this planning. But this is urgent for us. Can we do it in 3 months?
Right, yes. So that's a question we get consistently. I think in every country that I've helped support, they want to see the results now, they want it done. We take a step back, as I mentioned, this is like building a house, right? So you're trying to build a 2, 3, 4-story house. You want it in 3 months. There is no way that that would actually be possible, right? The foundational building blocks have to be put into place before you'll actually be able to yield those results. So that's essentially what I always come back and say, because if you look at these steps, I still have the slides. If you have all of this information ready, then yes, we can definitely get this started in 3 months. But for the most part, none of this information has been collected before, right? The entire system design will be based on what is your current baseline, and then what is your target that you want to get to. You might not necessarily, as I mentioned, be getting to that target at the end of year 3 or 4, but it's an end state that you define, you plan in to get there, and then put the building blocks in place to get those results. So no, you cannot accomplish this, at least year one, without all of these outcomes that we get, all this information that we need, you're not going to be able to get the results that you're looking for.
Thank you, Agatha. So we're planning for this, but we have poor internet connectivity in most of our schools. Does EMIS 2.0 require internet connectivity, or can basic mobile phones with SMS work?
So basic internet connectivity is not required at school level to deploy this framework, right? When you look at what it is that we have, data collection can happen using, SMS or using a mobile application. That data collection process is not mandated in terms of how it is that you collect data. What we mandate in EMIS 2.0 is the data governance principles around, once that data is collected, how is it protected and how is it managed and how is it shared between applications. So internet availability is not a constraint that any country should be worried about in terms of implementing this framework.
Another question that we often hear is, and we have an example in this policy academy. We currently have a totally manual paper-based system. Should we start by digitizing our old census data, or should we start afresh? And can you say something about these new open source data collection systems that we're hearing about?
Okay, I think one of the first things I would say about that is, before any country starts to engage in a new data collection exercise. So, if you have a country that, for example, has been doing this manually on paper, and they now have this new system that they can use to collect it, before they do that, my advice is that they should take full advantage of the existing data, even if this data is available purely on paper, and look at that data and ask themselves, is this data helping give us answers to some of the specific questions that we have? Because if the data is still not providing the answers that you need, automating the process of collecting that data is a pointless exercise, right? Because all you'll have is the data is now not on paper, it is sitting in a database somewhere, but it's still not helping inform what it is that you're looking for. So that's the first thing that I would say, is analyze the data that you have, whether it is on paper or whether it is electronic, and then look at that data and say, is it helping us answer these specific questions? Because if it is not, what additional data should we be collecting to answer those questions? Once you know that, then you come back to this roadmap and go through the process of system design. We now need this new data. Where is this data going to be collected from? So if it's going to be collected at the school level or at the county level, then how do we manage the process of collecting that new data? So I don't know if, Alex, that answers the first part of your question.
Yes, it does. Can you say something quickly about the open source systems? And I guess related to that, how much does all this cost?
How much does all of this cost? So there's many different ways that you can look at it. So the countries can ultimately determine which approach that they want to pursue. So there's two open source systems. So there's OpenEMIS that was funded by UNESCO, that's available free of cost. So, and then the second one is DHIS system. So there's DHIS 2 for education. That is open source as well. So it's available for free. Now, what is free is taking the software. What is not free is the operational cost of managing your specific deployment of that software. Both DHIS2 and OpenEMIS are currently managed by specific organizations who provide that service of management. And that's where the cost is, because that's operational day to day. So what we're able to do is connect the country to either OpenEMIS and DHIS2, and they would then be able to provide now those specific details of what that operational cost is. Does that answer your question in terms of cost?
Yes, Agatha, thank you. And my final question, actually, it's a two-part question, but can you say something about the capacity required at the ministry to run EMIS 2.0? And some ministries have software developers. Should they do it themselves, design their own system from scratch?
Right. So I'll start with your second question, because we have actually that challenge in place with one of the countries that we're working with, where they want to design an entire EMIS system because they have developers in place. So, from my perspective, that is not the best approach to take for many reasons. The one advantage that they would have is that, if you use your own software developers, then it's going to be a really customized system. You're going to get exactly what works for your country. You can put in any nitty-gritty feature that you or your minister is looking for. So customization is much more flexible if you design the system yourself. But the issue is with designing and deploying a system yourself is that system has not been tested globally. Which is the advantage of OpenAMIS, for example, or DHIS2. Those have been deployed in a huge number of other countries, and all of the bugs, all of the issues are constantly being updated onto the version that everybody has access to, right? So you don't personally have to face a challenge. Another country could have faced that challenge in advance of you, and you take advantage of that, and you're able to get that software with all of those bugs already fixed. Right. So that day-to-day management, in my view, it is better to outsource that to an organization that focuses purely on that for many more countries. I think countries individually will benefit more from that approach as opposed to trying to design their own system from scratch. The timeline for them to be able to start to get results from that system will be much, much longer than the 4 years that we put here. So that was the second part of your question. Remind me what the first piece was.
Yeah, actually, Agatha, in the interest of time, if you could we could use the chat function.
Sure.
I'm going to put a couple of questions for you in the chat, and then you can maybe respond to them. But Agatha, thank you so much. I see a lot of people who have appreciated this presentation. So back to you, Bob and Chris.
Fantastic job. Thanks, Alex and Agatha. And I think what was stressed here is the first principle of always asking why. What is the purpose of the investment? What is the type of data? And also just to make a link between EMIS 2 and our first presentation on the ecosystem, that looking at microservices and ways in which to de-risk the system, provide opportunities for smaller service providers to contribute to the system, I think is a key element to look at to try to kind of break down kind of a monolithic system to allow more participation in your systems. I'd like to now on the topic of systems and one of the key issues that was brought up again with Maria around learning systems. We want to introduce Fred, who's going to share some information on learning management systems, which is a big topic with regard to data as well, one step down from the EMIS system. So Fred, over to you.
Thank you, Bob, and hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I hope you can see my screen. I can't hear it, so if you just could confirm the saying that you can see it.
We can see it.
Okay, great. So I'm really trying to compress a lot of information in a few slides. So I'm sure that I'll leave some things out. I hope that for those of you that are less familiar with learning management systems, this is a good starting point. So first, starting with what is an LMS. So LMS stands for Learning Management System, and the learning management system is really at the core of any e-learning system. And the LMSs include a number of subcomponents, let's call it this way. One of the important ones that is quite obvious, and I'm sure this is the first thing that comes to mind, is really a platform to organize and to manage both content and how content comes together in terms of courses. But an LMS has another few important dimensions, namely the part of managing the learning. And this is how we really associate users with the content and manage how users access that content and interact with that content. So that's really the learning management part of the LMS. But there's also other aspects such as gamification or assessments, or even capturing microdata about the interaction between a student and the learning content. And I'll get to those things a little bit later. But it's really important that within the learning management system, a key part of that, it connects to what Agatha was referring to earlier, which is capturing data in a direct or indirect way about the experience of learning of the student and its interaction with the content, but also with other users, namely the teachers. And so the LMSs usually interact with other systems, namely the student information system, which is usually independent, but there's usually a data connection between those two, so that when students complete a module or complete an assessment, some of that information can be fed into the system that manages the information about the student himself. Also connected to the learning management system is usually a number of tools that are used to create contents. Those tools can be more or less integrated with the LMS, but what's really important is that the content is created in a way that works seamlessly in the learning management system, and we'll get to some of those standards a little bit later in the presentation. And so if you're looking to implementing a learning management system, there's a number of important factors that you need to think through. And although some of these might sound obvious, the reality is that, and that's the experience telling us, that a lot of these things are usually overlooked. And they're overlooked because we don't look at it in the depth that is required to really make the best decision for the environment we're implementing the LMS. And so things like, what's our offline capability of the platform, how are we going to support students that might have intermittent connectivity when they're outside, for instance, of the campus or the school, what type of bandwidth do we require for students to access certain types of content? How are we going to sustain this platform over time? How are we going to integrate this platform with other platforms? And maybe before getting to the rest, one of the critical things is really what kind of learning experience are we trying to support with the LMS? So going back to question that Bob was mentioning earlier, why are we implementing an LMS, and what kind of utilization do we expect this LMS to have by students and the overall community? And one of the really critical aspects of choosing an LMS is really to think if we have the resources to implement and to sustain this LMS over time. And this usually leads to the question of, should we go open source or should we get a commercial platform, and which standards do we want this platform to support, so that we ensure that the content and the data generated can be transmitted between the LMS and the other systems. And so some of the LMSs that are known in the market, most of you I'm sure have heard about Moodle. Moodle has both a open source version that you can download off of the website, but also there's managed and highly curated Moodle versions, for instance, OpenLMS. And so you can get the same functionalities, but either on a do-it-yourself or with a company behind it that really curates the whole platform, integrates plugins, and supports the platform over time. And so these are very different ways of implementing an LMS, and it really comes down to, do you have the resources that is required, and is it most cost effective to implement an open source or to consider a proprietary LMS? There's usually this perception that, because open source you can just download off the web, that the licensing itself is free. But the reality is that the fact that the license is free doesn't mean that the LMS is free. And the reason for that is because the implementation, customization, the updates, the integration of plugins usually require first manpower that is specialized in doing that. And also a lot of the functionalities that are added to the core of the LMS through plugins many times are paid. And so just the fact that the core is free doesn't mean that the whole platform is free to provide the types of functionalities that we would require. We see in a lot of these projects that we get involved in that connectivity is usually an issue. That's why I'm jumping straight into this dimension. And a lot of projects have a need to ensure that the content and the learning experience is brought closer to the user. so that the user, the student in this case, is less dependent on having stable connectivity. And there's a number of ways to do that. One of the common ones is to pre-install an interface in the device of the student and preload that platform with the content that the student will have to access. The other option is to get LMS servers, let's call it this way, in the school or in the university campus, so that students can have a local instance of the LMS. So there's a version of the LMS that's installed in those boxes, and the user accesses the LMS through the local network instead of using internet. And I'm putting here two examples of this type of boxes. One is the Moodle box, the other one is a device that is widely deployed by Critical Links, and both of them allow you to have like a local instance of your content, and this content can obviously be updated through USB or through the internet when you have connectivity. Some of the key cost decisions that you have to make when you're thinking about an LMS is really, the first is if it's going to be commercial or open source, and then if you're going to implement it yourself, or if you're going to hire a company to do it. So you can very well deploy Moodle, but hire a Moodle partner to do the implementation and the customization, or you could do it yourself. Or you could go for a Blackboard solution, in which case that would be a commercial solution, and you would probably get the support from Blackboard or one of their partners to do the customization and implementation. But here are some of the cost items that should be considered before making any decision around implementing an LMS. The other typical one is around where this LMS will be hosted. And if you're going to have your own data center, or you're going to use a software as a service kind of solution in which, you know, everything's managed for you in a third-party data center, and you have to only be worried about the customization and the content within the LMS. The other really important aspects of an LMS is the learning analytics. So learning analytics is really looking into what works for the student, what has best impact in the learning experience, but also things like, predict student performance or individualize the learning experience for the user. And so we achieve that by really looking to a very granular level of the interaction between the student and his content and the learning experience that we create for him. And this allows us, for instance, to compare two different approaches, two different types of content, do typical A/B testing, and see how that then reflects into the engagement and then the learning results of the students, and even predict things like, dropout or other potential disengagement type of indicators. And so to achieve this, it's really important that the LMS and the content itself is based on standards that ensures interoperability. And so there's a number of standards. Probably the most known one in the education is SCORM. SCORM has been around for a number of years, and SCORM basically ensures that you have certain types of indicators of metrics of engagement between the user and the content. But SCORM is usually limited by the fact that it only works on content that is hosted by the LMS. So if the user gets out of the LMS, for instance, to watch a YouTube video or to get onto Teams for a video conference, we lose the capability to collect information about the user's interaction on those outside of the platform. And so there's some new standards, newer standards that have the ability to provide indicators about how the student is dealing with this learning experience outside of the platform also. And so I'm just spelling out some of those for you here. IMS, which is one of these known bodies, has established a number of standards around how you would package the content and what type of data you could collect from the interaction of the user with the content. But also the evolution of SCORM is called XAPI or Experience API. And within Experience API, there's a very common standard now that's been used more and more called CMI5. And so probably I'm getting into a certain quite deep level of detail here, but this is just to show you that it's really important that when you define the LMS that you're going to deploy, that you're very clear about the standards that you're going to use for content and to collect the data about the learning experience of your users. So I'll stop here for today. I'm trying to keep myself within my 10 minutes, and I'll just pause for any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Fred. Please raise your hand if you want to jump in. I'm going to throw a question at you, Fred. I know we're short on time, so we're going to try to wind up in a minute or two. But you know, these knowledge packs are meant to be very practical, the how-to. So if you're a country, you have an existing LMS. How do you assess whether that's meeting your needs? How do you assess, including the time, if you want to shift to another system? And what are some of the considerations that the countries need to consider in terms of this shift and the assessment time? And there was a very basic question that I think you covered, just what is an LMS? Fred, over to you.
So should I maybe start with what is an LMS? So an LMS is a platform that allows us to organize and manage a digital learning experience. And so this is quite broad as a definition, but it's really trying to go beyond what would be a content management system, which is basically a platform to organize content, and add a layer above that that allows me to understand which user should have access to which type of content, eventually even personalize the learning experience according to the level of knowledge of the user. For instance, I could run a quiz, and based on your results of the quiz, I would create a custom learning path just for you. So the learning management is really around that. And also being able to record assessments, to gamify your experience, to provide data, collect and provide data about your interaction with the content. Right? Also could support things like integrating with the other platforms such as virtual reality or Zoom or Teams for video conferencing. So it's really a platform that integrates the content with a number of other learning experiences. Going back to making decisions. So the biggest decision that needs to be made is around what kind of functionalities do I require? Do I really need to support online examination? And if I do, then I would need a proctoring system, probably to monitor my students when they're outside of my classroom doing an exam. And so does my LMS support that functionality? Do I have a plugin that I can add to my LMS to do that? What kind of proctoring system am I looking at? So the first thing is, what kind of functionality do I really need? And does my LMS support the kind of use case scenarios that I'm trying to support? So that would be the first one. The second one is, do I have the knowledge to deploy, customize, and maintain my system? And if I don't, do I want to build that knowledge? Do I want to build that capability? Or do I want to get a partner to support me? Or finally, do I want a software as a service solution in which I don't have to be bothered about how things are set up and customized, and I just use it, right? I just request functionalities, and someone else behind me will
yeah, I think this is a critical point, and I think the idea of plug-in is akin to the idea of interoperability and the modularity that was discussed in the EMIS around microservices. Right. And again, the theme here is being able to create flexible systems that are interoperable and that allow for standards and information and data to communicate with each other. So it's a nice transition between kind of the broader EMIS and then the specific LMS example. Thanks, Fred. I know we have a couple minutes left, so I want to pass over to my colleague Iñaki, who's going to walk you through some of the objectives for this final week of the Policy Academy. But a huge thanks to Fred as well as Agatha for these presentations, and Maria, of course, as well. Iñaki, over to you.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you to Maria, Agatha, and Fred for this fantastic session. We only have 2 minutes, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things for this week. As Bob mentioned at the beginning of today, this week is focused on being data-driven. So first of all, we invite you to go to the platform, to go to that final week in the map, to the final mission, thinking on that data aspect. And also I invite you to go to the forum. There is actually a thread, a conversation on all these topics where we have many resources interesting to that. So please go there and try to join the conversation. The next thing is that today you will be receiving 2 things. One, very important for us, and also part of the course and for the completion of the course is a survey. The country champions, they did an initial survey just to understand better the context, to understand some of the challenges. And for us, it's going to be very critical that all of you please submit the final survey that you will be receiving, and this will help us improve this Policy Academy moving forward. The second thing that you will be receiving today is an invite, a calendar invite for this Friday. So this is the final week, and on Friday we will have the final session. And the final session, we will have some guest participants. We will listen to your final presentation of the projects. Again, the presentation of the projects, but something very simple. You will find in the platform a structure of six slides, and we invite all the teams to try to connect, to try to practice, to try to do a rehearsal of that presentation. We will have simultaneous interpretation for French and for Portuguese. And again, maybe the face-to-face meeting this Thursday, we can discuss with the instructor and the teams more details on that presentation. So those are the key ideas. This is the final week. So all the best to all of you. Please join the conversation, go to the platform, continue this fantastic work. Nothing else to add on my side. Cristobal, Bob, any final words on your side?
Bravo. And as always, if you have any issues or questions, reach out to us as instructors, and we're here for you. But good luck this final week. We look forward to connecting on our country team check-ins, and then to connect with everybody for our final session, along with recognition of your work and certification on Friday. Have an awesome week, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.